For 40 years, I let my late husband's family treat me like hired help at every gathering, cleaning up after them and enduring their insults about my humble background. But when they literally spat on me at this year's reunion and told me to know my place, they had no idea I was about to reveal that the mansion they were celebrating and the one they thought belonged to my brother-in-law Harrison actually had my name on the deed. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I'm 73 years old. For decades, I've been the invisible woman at the Thornfield family gatherings, invisible except when they needed someone to clean, cook, serve, and disappear. It all started when I married Thomas Thornfield in the spring of 1982. I was a simple school librarian from Millbrook, a small town where everyone knew everyone and a good reputation was worth more than money. Thomas was from the prestigious Thornfield family of Ashford Heights, old money that traced back for generations, old traditions that hadn't changed since the 1920s, and very old prejudices about who belonged in their aristocratic circle. The Thornfield name meant something in our state. Thomas's great-grandfather had built a railroad empire. His grandfather had expanded into steel manufacturing. His father, Edmund, had diversified into real estate and banking. By the time I met Thomas at the Millbrook Public Library where I worked, the family controlled half the commercial properties in 3 counties and held board positions on every major charity organization within 100 miles. Thomas had come to the library researching local history for a business proposal. He was handsome in that effortless way that comes with good breeding and better nutrition, tall, silver-haired even in his 30s, with hands that had never seen manual labor. I was 31, never married, living in a tiny apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery, driving a 15-year-old Honda that broke down every other month. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Thomas was charming, attentive, and completely unlike anyone I'd ever met. He took me to restaurants where the menus had no prices, bought me dresses that cost more than I made in a month, introduced me to wines I couldn't pronounce. For 6 months, I felt like Cinderella. The spell broke the night he brought me home to meet his family. Ravens Hollow Estate sat on 200 acres of manicured grounds in Ashford Heights, a Gothic revival mansion that had been featured in architectural magazines. As we pulled up the circular driveway lined with ancient oak trees, Thomas squeezed my hand. "Don't worry," he said. "They're going to love you." They did not love me. Thomas's mother, Vivian Thornfield, was 68 years old then. A silver-haired matriarch who wore pearls to breakfast and had never worked a day in her life. She greeted me in the marble foyer beneath a crystal chandelier that probably cost more than my annual salary. "Well," she said, looking me up and down in my modest blue dress from JCPenney. I suppose Thomas could have done worse. Her voice carried the kind of cultivated accent that rich people develop to distinguish themselves from ordinary folk. Thomas's brother Harrison, 2 years older and already running the family's real estate division, just smirked from his position by the mahogany bar. "At least she looks house-drained," he said, swirling an amber liquid in a crystal tumbler. Harrison's wife, Celeste, emerged from the library wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than I made in 3 months. She was blonde, beautiful, and had gone to the same private schools as the Thornfield boys. "How charming," she said with a smile that never reached her eyes. "Thomas is always bringing home strays." The youngest brother, Frederick, was 28 and fresh out of business school. He barely acknowledged my existence, too busy discussing stock portfolios with his father Edmund, a stern man with steel-gray hair and eyes like winter frost. But I loved Thomas, and I was determined to prove myself worthy of the Thornfield name. I thought if I just tried hard enough, worked hard enough, sacrificed enough, they would eventually accept me as family. I was painfully naive. From our wedding day forward, I became their unpaid servant. Every Christmas gathering at Ravens Hollow Estate, every Easter brunch, every 4th of July barbecue, every summer reunion I was the one setting tables for 40 people, polishing silver that had been in the family for generations, ranging flowers from the estate gardens, cooking elaborate meals that took days to prepare. The Thornfield family had traditions that went back decades. The Christmas Eve dinner required 7 courses served on china that had belonged to Thomas's great-grandmother. The Easter brunch needed fresh flowers in every room, hand-embroidered linens, and a buffet that could feed an army. The summer reunion was a 3-day affair that brought relatives from across the country to celebrate the family's continued prosperity. And through every single event, I was the one making it happen. While Vivian held court in the parlor, regaling guests with stories of the family's illustrious past, I was in the kitchen, my hands raw from peeling vegetables and scrubbing pots. While Harrison and Celeste entertained guests with their European vacation slides, I was upstairs, changing bed linens and cleaning bathrooms for relatives who would stay the weekend. While Frederick discussed his latest business ventures with admiring cousins, I was setting up tables and chairs in the garden, hanging lights, arranging place settings for dozens of people. The work was backbreaking, but I told myself it was temporary. Once they saw how dedicated I was, how much I cared about the family traditions, they would accept me. They would see that I belonged. Years passed. Thomas and I never had children, something Vivian reminded me of regularly. Such a shame, she would say, loud enough for everyone to hear, that the Thornfield line might end because some people are too selfish to fulfill their basic obligations. When I suggested we could adopt, Harrison laughed outright. Can you imagine bringing some random child into this family? We have standards to maintain. When I mentioned that I might want to pursue a master's degree in library science, Celeste practically gasped. Whatever for? It's not like you have a real career to worry about. Your job is taking care of this family. So I gave up my dreams of advancement. I gave up the possibility of children. I gave up pieces of myself, year after year, thinking that each sacrifice would buy me a place at their table. I used my librarian salary, modest as it was, to contribute to family expenses. When Harrison's oldest daughter Penelope wanted to attend an expensive private art school in Vermont, I quietly contributed $5,000 to her tuition. When Frederick's son Oliver needed orthodontic work that wasn't covered by insurance, I paid the bill without being asked. When the estate's roof needed repairs after a severe storm, I handed over my entire savings account, $12,000 I'd been putting aside for Thomas's and my retirement. Through it all, they never once said thank you. They never acknowledged my contributions. To them, I wasn't Eleanor, I was just Thomas's wife, the outsider who should be grateful they tolerated my presence in their ancestral home. The pattern became more entrenched over the decades. At every gathering, I would arrive hours early to begin preparations. I would work through the entire event, ensuring every detail was perfect. Every guest was comfortable, every tradition was maintained. And at the end of each gathering, I would clean up the mess while the family relaxed in the parlor, discussing their important business dealings and social obligations. When Thomas's arthritis began affecting his hands in his early 60s, I became his caregiver too. I drove him to every doctor's appointment in 3 different cities, learning to navigate complex medical systems and insurance bureaucracy. I managed all his medications, setting up weekly pill organizers and maintaining detailed charts of what he needed to take when. When his condition worsened and he struggled with simple tasks like buttoning shirts or opening jars, I helped him dress each morning and cut his food at dinner. The family noticed Thomas's decline, of course, but they seemed to expect that I would handle everything. Thank goodness Eleanor is so capable, Vivian would say. As if my devotion to her son was merely a convenient arrangement rather than love. When Vivian had her stroke at age 85, I spent 3 months sleeping in a chair beside her hospital bed. The doctor said family presence could aid recovery, so I made sure she was never alone. I fed her when she couldn't hold a spoon, read to her from the romance novels she pretended not to enjoy, brushed her silver hair every morning, and advocated with nurses and doctors when her care wasn't meeting my standards. Harrison visited twice during those 3 months. Frederick came once, stayed for 20 minutes, and spent most of the time taking business calls in the hallway. Celeste sent flowers. When Vivian recovered enough to return home, I arranged for physical therapy, modified the mansion's first floor to accommodate her mobility limitations, and created a care schedule that ensured she had everything she needed. She never thanked me, but I told myself that her recovery was thanks enough. When Celeste left Harrison for another man, specifically her personal trainer, Marcus, who was 15 years younger and devastatingly handsome. I stepped in to help. With their twin daughters, Amanda and Rebecca. They were 8 years old then, confused and angry about their parents' divorce, acting out at school and refusing to do homework. For 2 years, I picked them up from Ashford Academy every Friday afternoon and kept them for the weekend while Harrison worked through his depression at the Riverside Country Club bar. I helped them with math homework, braided their long blonde hair for dance recitals, took them to soccer practice and piano lessons, taught them to bake cookies in the mansion's enormous kitchen. I loved those little girls as if they were my own grandchildren. When Amanda had nightmares about her parents' divorce, I would sit by her bed reading fairy tales until she fell asleep. When Rebecca struggled with reading, I used my librarian training to help her discover books that captured her imagination. I attended every school play, every sports game, every recital that Harrison was too busy or too drunk to attend. Eventually, Harrison remarried a younger woman named Diana who made it clear that my services as weekend babysitter were no longer needed. The girls need to bond with their new stepmother, she announced. Having you around just confuses their loyalties. I never saw Amanda and Rebecca alone again, though I continued to send birthday cards and Christmas gifts that were never acknowledged. Through all of these years, all of these sacrifices, I kept hoping that someday I would be seen as family rather than hired help. I organized every birthday party, researching the honored person's favorite foods and decorating themes. I planned every anniversary celebration, creating photo displays and memory books that took weeks to prepare. I handled every funeral arrangement. When elderly relatives passed away, coordinating with caterers and florists and clergy, making sure that even in grief, the family's traditions were maintained. When Thomas's uncle Benjamin died, I spent 4 days cooking for the reception that followed his funeral. When Harrison's father-in-law had a heart attack, I arranged for meal deliveries to his widow for 6 weeks. When Frederick's mother-in-law was diagnosed with dementia, I researched care facilities and helped the family navigate the complex process of finding appropriate placement. The family grew to expect my contributions as a matter of course. If someone needed help, Eleanor would handle it. If an event needed organizing, Eleanor would take care of the details. If a crisis arose, Eleanor would find a solution. And through it all, they never once expressed gratitude. They never acknowledged that their smooth, comfortable lives were built on my unpaid labor. They never recognized that the traditions they treasured were maintained by my constant effort. When Thomas died 3 years ago after a long battle with pancreatic cancer, I thought maybe finally they might see me as family. I thought 38 years of devotion, of putting their needs before my own, of sacrificing my own dreams for their comfort, might have earned me a permanent place in their lives. I had never been more wrong about anything in my life. The day after Thomas's funeral, Harrison showed up at the small house Thomas and I had bought in Millbrook, a modest 3-bedroom ranch that was our refuge from the grandeur and demands of Ravens Hollow estate. He didn't even step inside when I opened the door. He just stood on my front porch, holding a manila folder, looking like he was conducting unpleasant business. "Eleanor," he said, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone I'd heard for decades, "we need to discuss your situation. Now that Thomas is gone, there's really no reason for you to keep attending family functions. It might be easier for everyone if you just moved on with your life." From the passenger seat of his silver Mercedes, I could see Vivian nodding approvingly. At 89, she was still sharp as a razor and twice as cutting. She rolled down her window just enough to speak. "Nothing personal, dear. It's just that you were never really one of us, were you? You served your purpose." They drove away before I could respond, leaving me standing in my doorway with my mouth open, holding the folder Harrison had thrust into my hands. Inside were photocopies of my husband's will and estate documents, highlighting the sections that confirmed I had no legal claim to any Thornfield family assets or properties. But I kept showing up to family gatherings anyway. Call it stubbornness, call it hope, call it for decades of habit. I don't know what drove me. Maybe I thought that if I just proved myself one more time, cooked one more perfect meal, cleaned up one more mess, organized one more flawless event, they would finally see me as family rather than staff. Maybe I was addicted to the hope that someday, someone would look at me and say, "Thank you, Eleanor. We couldn't have done this without you." That's how I ended up at the 2024 Thornfield Summer Reunion, standing in the massive kitchen of Ravenshollow Estate at 6 a.m. on a humid July morning. My 73-year-old hands already cramping as I began preparing a feast for 45 relatives who saw me as nothing more than convenient free labor. What they didn't know, as they slept in their comfortable beds throughout the mansion, was that this would be the last time I would ever serve them. This would be the reunion where everything changed. This would be the day they learned exactly who Eleanor Hartwell really was, and what price they would pay for 40 years of taking me for granted. The morning of the 2024 Thornfield Summer Reunion began like every other gathering for the past 4 decades. I arrived at Ravenshollow Estate before dawn, my ancient Honda Civic coughing and sputtering up the circular driveway like an unwelcome intruder. In paradise, the mansion loomed before me in the pre-dawn darkness, its Gothic Revival architecture casting long shadows across the perfectly manicured grounds. At 73, my body protested every movement as I unloaded box after box of groceries from my car. My arthritic hands ached as I carried heavy bags up the marble steps to the grand entrance, my lower back screaming with each trip. But I had learned long ago that complaining was pointless. The Thornfield family expected perfection, and perfection required sacrifice. The estate's kitchen was a monument to culinary ambition, professional-grade appliances, marble countertops that stretched for yards, copper pots that hung like gleaming trophies from wrought iron racks. It was a kitchen designed for a staff of professional caterers, not a 73-year-old widow working alone. But this had been my domain for 40 years, and I knew every cabinet, every drawer, every quirk of the temperamental ovens. By 6:30 a.m., I had the first batch of dinner rolls rising in the warming drawer and 3 different marinades prepared for the various meats that would grace the reunion's elaborate buffet. The menu I had planned was ambitious even by Thornfield standards: herb-crusted leg of lamb, honey-glazed ham, grilled salmon with dill sauce, roasted vegetables from the estate's gardens, 3 different potato dishes, an array of salads. That would require hours of chopping and preparation. For dessert, I had committed to making Vivian's favorite lemon torte, a 6-layer monstrosity that required separating 2 dozen eggs and tempering chocolate for the decorative garnish. I had also promised to recreate great-grandmother Thornfield's famous apple pie, using a recipe that was supposedly a family secret but which I had perfected through years of trial and error because no one else in the family could be bothered to learn it. As I worked in the pre-dawn quiet, my mind wandered to the guest list Harrison had emailed me 3 weeks earlier. 45 people would descend on Ravenshollow Estate for this year's reunion: cousins from California, aunts and uncles from Vermont, second cousins from Florida, and various in-laws and hangers-on who claimed connection to the Thornfield legacy. They would arrive expecting luxury, comfort, and flawless service, never questioning who provided it. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was preparing a feast for people who would barely acknowledge my existence. At last year's reunion, cousin Patricia from San Diego had actually snapped her fingers at me when she wanted her wine glass refilled. Service, she had called out, as if I were hired help rather than family. When I had quietly reminded her that I was Thomas's widow, she had laughed. "Oh, Eleanor, you're so funny, you know what I mean." I did know what she meant. I had always known what they meant. The first family members began arriving around 9 a.m., their luxury vehicles purring up the driveway like a parade of prosperity. Harrison emerged from the mansion's master suite, the rooms that had once belonged to his parents but which he had claimed after Edmund's death 5 years earlier. He was dressed in expensive casual wear that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in an entire year: pressed khakis, a polo shirt with a designer logo, loafers that gleamed with fresh polish. "Eleanor," he said, barely glancing in my direction as he poured himself coffee from the pot I had prepared, "I trust everything is under control for this afternoon." "Of course," I replied, not looking up from the onions I was dicing for the potato salad. My eyes were already watering from the sharp fumes. But I had learned to work through discomfort decades ago. Good. Diana's mother is coming this year, and she has very particular expectations about food quality. We can't afford any embarrassments. He sipped his coffee and made a face. This is rather weak, isn't it? Could you make a fresh pot? I had been awake for 4 hours and had already made 3 pots of coffee, adjusting the strength each time because Harrison's preferences seemed to change with his mood. But I nodded and reached for the coffee beans, grinding them fresh while he watched impatiently. Also, he continued, we're expecting the Ashworth family from Boston. You remember them? They invested in our Portland development project. Make sure their children are accommodated properly. Young Michael has food allergies, and his sister only eats organic vegetables. This was the first I was hearing about specific dietary restrictions, though the reunion was only hours away. I made mental notes to check my ingredient lists and possibly make an emergency trip to the organic market in town. Harrison's new wife Diana appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking perfectly put together despite the early hour. She was 42, exactly half Harrison's age, with the kind of effortless beauty that came from excellent genetics and expensive maintenance. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail that had probably taken 30 minutes to achieve. And her yoga outfit cost more than most people's monthly rent. Oh good, you're here, she said to me, as if my presence at a family reunion where I was doing all the work was somehow surprising. I've invited a few additional guests' friends from my Pilates class. I hope that won't be a problem. A few additional guests. At a reunion where I had already planned food for 45 people, where every detail had been carefully calculated to accommodate the guest list Harrison had provided. But Diana's tone made it clear this wasn't a request, it was an instruction. How many additional guests? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Oh, just 6 or 7. Maybe 8. They're all very easygoing. Diana waved her hand dismissively. I'm sure you can just make more of whatever you're making. Just make more, as if feeding 50+ people was as simple as adding water to a recipe. As if the lamb I had special ordered from the organic farm in Millbrook could be magically multiplied. As if the hours of preparation I had already invested could be casually extended to accommodate last-minute additions. I'll manage, I said, because it was what I always said. It was what they expected me to say. Diana smiled brightly. Wonderful. You're such a treasure, Eleanor. I don't know how this family functioned before you came along. Before I came along. As if my 40 years of service were a recent development rather than for decades of unpaid labor. As if the family had somehow been helpless before I married Thomas and devoted my life to their comfort. By 10 a.m., more family members were arriving. And the mansion was filling with the sounds of reunion excitement, laughter from the parlor. Children's voices echoing through the halls, car doors slamming as more relatives pulled up the circular driveway. I could hear conversations drifting from the terrace where early arrivals were enjoying mimosas and catching up on family news. Meanwhile, I was in the kitchen, frantically adjusting recipes to accommodate Diana's last-minute additions. I called the organic market and arranged for an emergency delivery of additional ingredients. Using my own credit card because I knew asking Harrison for reimbursement would result in a lecture about managing expenses more efficiently. Frederick arrived with his family around 10:30. His wife Jennifer trailing behind with their 3 children, 2 teenagers and a 10-year-old who immediately began exploring the mansion's vast interior. With the kind of entitled confidence that came from believing the world existed for their entertainment. Eleanor, Frederick called out as he entered the kitchen, his voice carrying the forced enthusiasm people use when they want something. Wonderful to see you. I hope you're planning to make your famous chocolate mousse cake. Jennifer's been talking about it for months. My famous chocolate mousse cake. The recipe I had developed 3 years of experimentation, the dessert that had become a family tradition, the one dish that several relatives specifically requested at every gathering. The cake that took 6 hours to prepare properly and required techniques I had learned from French pastry cookbooks because no one in the Thornfield family had ever bothered to learn to cook. I hadn't planned on making the chocolate mousse this year, I said carefully. The menu is already quite extensive, and with the additional guests Diana mentioned, but you must," Jennifer interrupted, appearing in the kitchen doorway with a martini already in her hand despite the early hour. "It's not a Thornfield reunion without Eleanor's chocolate mousse cake. The children will be so disappointed." The children. As if my decades of labor were primarily motivated by a desire to please 3 kids who had never once thanked me for anything I had done for them. As if disappointing entitled teenagers was a tragedy worth reorganizing an entire feast to prevent. But I nodded, as I always did. I would find a way to make the chocolate mousse cake, just as I always found a way to accommodate every request, every demand, every last-minute addition to my already overwhelming responsibilities. By 11 a.m., I was working at a pace that would have been challenging for a professional kitchen staff, let alone a 73-year-old woman working alone. My hands moved automatically through tasks I had performed thousands of times: chopping vegetables, stirring sauces, checking temperatures, adjusting seasonings. My feet ached in the comfortable shoes I had learned to wear for these marathon cooking sessions, and my lower back sent shooting pains up my spine every time I bent to check something in the oven. The relatives continued to arrive throughout the morning, each group bringing their own expectations and demands. Cousin Margaret from Vermont needed a quiet room for her afternoon nap because she had developed sensitivity to noise in her old age. Uncle David from California required a special parking spot near the entrance because his new hip replacement made walking difficult. The Ashworth family from Boston arrived with not just food allergies but specific requirements for room temperature, background music volume, and even the thread count of the bed linens. Each new demand was delivered to me as if I were the mansion's concierge rather than a family member. People would find me in the kitchen and make requests as if I were paid staff whose job was to ensue their comfort. No one asked if I needed help. No one offered to take over any part of the preparations. No one seemed to consider that I might be tired, overwhelmed, or deserving of consideration. Around noon, as I was putting the finishing touches on the herb crust for the leg of lamb, Vivian made her grand entrance. At 89, she still commanded attention when she entered a room, though she now needed a walking cane and moved more slowly than in previous years. She had dressed for the reunion as if it were a formal event, a navy blue dress with pearl accessories. Her silver hair styled in the same elegant updo she had worn for decades. "Eleanor," she said, settling into one of the kitchen's comfortable chairs as if she were holding court, "I trust everything is proceeding according to plan." "Yes, Mrs. Thornfield," I replied, using the formal address I had maintained for decades despite being her daughter-in-law. Vivian had never invited familiarity, and I had learned early in my marriage that presuming intimacy was a mistake she would not forgive. "Excellent. I've been telling everyone how fortunate we are to have you handling the arrangements. Such a relief not to have to worry about the details." She sipped the tea I had prepared for her without being asked, a ritual that had developed over the years. "Though I do hope you're not overtaxing yourself. You're not getting any younger, are you? You're not getting any younger." The subtle reminder that my usefulness to the family had an expiration date, that my value was tied entirely to my ability to serve their needs. At 89, Vivian was only 16 years older than me. But she spoke as if I were ancient while she remained eternally vital. "I'm managing fine," I said, because it was what she wanted to hear. "Good. Because Harrison mentioned that you seemed a bit frayed at last Christmas. We wouldn't want any slip-ups today. With so many important guests in attendance." Frayed. I had been frayed at Christmas because I had been recovering from a bout of pneumonia that had kept me in bed for 2 weeks in November. But I had still managed to prepare the 7-course Christmas Eve dinner, arrange all the gifts, and coordinate the caroling party that had become a family tradition. If I had seemed frayed, it was because I had been working while still weak from illness, driven by the knowledge that the family's expectations wouldn't adjust to accommodate my human limitations. As the afternoon approached and guests gathered on the terrace for pre-dinner cocktails, I found myself moving through the kitchen like a machine programmed for perfection. Every dish had to be flawless, every presentation had to be elegant, every detail had to meet the impossibly high standards the Thornfield family had maintained for generations. But as I worked, something inside me began to shift. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the accumulated weight of 40 years of thankless service. Maybe it was the clarity that sometimes comes with age, but I began to see the situation with new eyes. I was 73 years old, working alone to serve 50-plus people who treated me like hired help. I was using my own money to buy groceries for millionaires who could afford to hire professional caterers. I was sacrificing my health and energy for people who had never once expressed genuine gratitude for my efforts, and I was doing it all in a house that they believed belonged to Harrison. They had no idea that 3 months after Thomas's death, when I was drowning in grief and medical bills, I had received an unexpected phone call from the law firm of Whitmore, Sterling and Associates in downtown Ashford Heights. The senior partner, James Whitmore III, had requested a private meeting to discuss matters pertaining to the estate of Mrs. Evelyn Thornfield. Evelyn Thornfield had been Thomas's grandmother, the matriarch who had died when Thomas was 12 years old. I had never met her, knew her only through family stories and the portraits that hung in Ravenshallow's grand hallway. She had been, by all accounts, a formidable woman who had helped build the family fortune and who had strong opinions about family loyalty and personal character. The meeting with James Whitmore had changed everything I thought I knew about my place in the Thornfield family. But as I stood in the kitchen that afternoon, watching relatives laugh and socialize on the terrace while I worked in isolation, none of them had any idea what Evelyn Thornfield's will had revealed. They believed I was the poor relation, the outsider who should be grateful for their tolerance. They believed I was dependent on their charity, vulnerable and powerless without Thomas's protection. They had never been more wrong about anything in their lives. As I put the final touches on the afternoon's feast, I realized that this reunion would be different from all the others. This would be the day they learned exactly who held the power at Ravenshollow Estate. This would be the day they discovered that the woman they had been treating like a servant actually held their entire world in her hands. But first, I had to endure a few more hours of their condescension. I had to let them reveal their true characters completely, had to let them dig their own graves with their words and actions. Because when the truth finally came out, I wanted there to be no doubt about who deserved what was coming to them. The formal dining began at 2 p.m., and by 2:15, I knew this reunion would be unlike any other in the worst possible way. I had just finished arranging the last of the serving platters on the mahogany buffet table when Harrison's voice boomed across the dining room with an announcement that made my blood freeze. "Before we begin this wonderful feast," he said, raising his crystal wine glass high above his head, "I have some exciting news to share with everyone." The 48 guests Diana's last-minute additions had turned into 8 extra people gathered around the dining room table and spilled into the adjacent parlor. Wine glasses clinked as people settled into their seats, the buzz of conversation dying down as Harrison commanded attention. I stood by the kitchen doorway, my hands still damp from washing the final prep dishes, watching the family that had consumed 40 years of my life prepare to hear whatever announcement Harrison deemed worthy of interrupting the meal I had spent 14 hours preparing. "As many of you know," Harrison continued, his voice carrying the satisfied tone of a man about to deliver good news, "Diana and I have been working with developers on an exciting new project." Diana beamed from her seat at the head of the table, the seat that had once belonged to Vivian, then to Edmund, and which Harrison had claimed as his birthright. She was wearing a different outfit than this morning, a flowing summer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her blonde hair now styled in loose waves that caught the light from the crystal chandelier. After months of negotiations, Harrison announced, "We've finalized the sale of Ravenshollow Estate to Meridian Development Corporation. They're going to transform this beautiful property into an exclusive luxury resort and spa." The words hit me like a physical blow. Sale of Ravenshollow Estate. The mansion where I had worked for decades, the kitchen where I was standing at that very moment, the gardens where I had arranged flowers for countless family celebrations. Harrison was selling it all. But that wasn't the worst part. Worst part was what came next. "The sale will close in 60 days, Harrison continued, his smile growing wider as appreciative murmurs rose from the gathered relatives. And the best part is, the purchase price will provide a substantial windfall for everyone in the family. Diana and I have decided to distribute the proceeds among all the Thornfield descendants as a way of sharing our good fortune. Applause erupted around the room. Cousin Patricia from San Diego actually squealed with delight. Uncle David from California raised his wine glass in a toast. Frederick and Jennifer exchanged excited glances, probably already planning how to spend their unexpected inheritance. "How much are we talking about?" called out Cousin Robert from Vermont, his voice carrying the barely contained greed that money announcements always inspired in the Thornfield family. $12 million, Harrison announced proudly. After taxes and fees, we're looking at roughly $10 million to distribute among the family members. The room exploded in celebration. Wine glasses clinked in impromptu toasts, people hugged and laughed and immediately began discussing vacation plans and investment strategies. Vivienne, seated in her wheelchair near the fireplace, nodded approvingly as if Harrison had just announced a successful business merger rather than the destruction of the family's ancestral home. I stood frozen in the doorway, watching the celebration unfold, feeling like I was witnessing the desecration of everything I had spent my life protecting and maintaining. But the real shock was still coming. "Of course," Harrison said, raising his hand for quiet, "this windfall is for family members only. Blood relatives in their..." As the afternoon approached and guests gathered on the terrace for pre-dinner cocktails, I found myself moving through the kitchen like a machine programmed for perfection. Every dish had to be flawless, every presentation had to be elegant, every detail had to meet the impossibly high standards the Thornfield family had maintained for generations. But as I worked, something inside me began to shift. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was the accumulated weight of 40 years of thankless service. Maybe it was the clarity that sometimes comes with age, but I began to see the situation with new eyes. I was 73 years old, working alone to serve 50-plus people who treated me like hired help. I was using my own money to buy groceries for millionaires who could afford to hire professional caterers. I was sacrificing my health and energy for people who had never once expressed genuine gratitude for my efforts, and I was doing it all in a house that they believed belonged to Harrison. They had no idea that 3 months after Thomas's death, when I was drowning in grief and medical bills, I had received an unexpected phone call from the law firm of Whitmore, Sterling and Associates in downtown Ashford Heights. The senior partner, James Whitmore III, had requested a private meeting to discuss matters pertaining to the estate of Mrs. Evelyn Thornfield. Evelyn Thornfield had been Thomas's grandmother, the matriarch who had died when Thomas was 12 years old. I had never met her, knew her only through family stories and the portraits that hung in Ravenshallow's grand hallway. She had been, by all accounts, a formidable woman who had helped build the family fortune and who had strong opinions about family loyalty and personal character. The meeting with James Whitmore had changed everything I thought I knew about my place in the Thornfield family. But as I stood in the kitchen that afternoon, watching relatives laugh and socialize on the terrace while I worked in isolation, none of them had any idea what Evelyn Thornfield's will had revealed. They believed I was the poor relation, the outsider who should be grateful for their tolerance. They believed I was dependent on their charity, vulnerable and powerless without Thomas's protection. They had never been more wrong about anything in their lives. As I put the final touches on the afternoon's feast, I realized that this reunion would be different from all the others. This would be the day they learned exactly who held the power at Ravenshollow Estate. This would be the day they discovered that the woman they had been treating like a servant actually held their entire world in her hands. But first, I had to endure a few more hours of their condescension. I had to let them reveal their true characters completely, had to let them. The legal documentation is quite clear, Diana added, pulling out a folder that she must have prepared specifically for this moment. The estate sale proceeds will be distributed only to individuals who can demonstrate direct bloodline connection to the Thornfield family or current marriage to a blood relative. Current marriage to a blood relative. Thomas had been dead for 3 years. In their minds, my connection to the family had died with him. I think that's perfectly reasonable, declared Cousin Patricia, her voice slightly slurred from the wine. she had been consuming since mid-morning. Eleanor's had a good run, but it's time for the real family to benefit from our heritage, the real family. After 40 years of cooking their meals, cleaning their messes, organizing their celebrations, caring for their children, nursing their sick, and maintaining their traditions, I was not considered real family. But surely Eleanor deserves some recognition for her years of service, suggested Jennifer, Frederick's wife, though her tone made it clear this was a token protest rather than genuine advocacy. Perhaps a small token of appreciation? Oh, absolutely, Diana said quickly, her voice dripping with false magnanimity. We've discussed this, and we think a nice dinner set would be appropriate, something Eleanor could use in her own home. A nice dinner set, for 40 years of unpaid labor, for decades of sacrifice and devotion, for countless thousands of dollars of my own money spent on their expenses, for my entire adult life dedicated to their comfort. Actually, Harrison said, reaching into his jacket pocket. We have something even better. He pulled out an envelope and walked toward me, his expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and performative generosity. The entire room watched as he approached. Dozens of pairs of eyes tracking his movement like spectators at a tennis match. Eleanor, he said, holding out the envelope, Diana and I want you to have this as a token of the family's appreciation for everything you've done over the years. I took the envelope with hands that I was surprised to find completely steady. Inside was a check made out to me in the amount of $5,000. $5,000. For 40 years of my life. We thought that was a generous amount, Diana said, her voice carrying undertones of self-congratulation. Enough for Eleanor to take a nice vacation or maybe redecorate her little house in Millbrook. Her little house in Millbrook, the modest ranch home that Thomas and I had bought as our refuge from the demands of Ravens Hollow Estate. The place where we had planned to spend our retirement years together before cancer stole him away. I think that's very generous, Vivian pronounced from her wheelchair, as if her approval was the final word on my worth to the family. Eleanor should be quite grateful for such thoughtfulness, grateful. They expected me to be grateful for being dismissed from the family like a servant whose employment was being terminated, grateful for a $5,000 severance payment after 4 decades of unpaid devotion, grateful for being excluded from the sale of a house where I had worked harder than any of them had ever worked in their entire lives. Of course, Harrison continued, his tone shifting to something that might have been intended as kindness but came across as condescension. This does mean that after today, there won't really be any need for you to attend family gatherings anymore. The new owners will be taking possession of Ravens Hollow in 60 days, and after that, well, their family events will be held in different venues, smaller, more intimate settings that are really just for immediate family. Just for immediate family. After 40 years, I was being formally disinvited from the family I had served with every fiber of my being. I'm sure you understand, Diana added, her smile as sharp as broken crystal. It's nothing personal. It's just that family dynamics change over time. And we want to make sure everyone feels comfortable at our gatherings. Everyone feels comfortable. They wanted to make sure they could enjoy their newfound wealth without the awkward presence of the woman who had made their comfortable lives possible. The room had grown completely silent. 48 pairs of eyes watching me as if I were a specimen in a laboratory experiment. Some faces showed embarrassment, others showed curiosity, but most showed nothing more than mild interest in how the dismissed servant would react to her termination. I looked down at the check in my hands, at the $5,000 that Harrison and Diana apparently believed was adequate compensation for my life's work. I thought about all the money I had contributed to family expenses over the years, the college tuitions, the medical bills, the home repairs, the countless gifts and contributions that had never been acknowledged or repaid. I thought about the countless hours I had spent in this very kitchen, preparing meals that had brought this family together for celebrations and holidays. I thought about the sleepless nights I had spent caring for sick relatives, the weekends I had sacrificed to babysit ungrateful children, the vacations I had never taken because I was always needed for some family obligation. I thought about Thomas, who had loved me enough to marry me despite his family's disapproval, who had promised me that someday I would be accepted as a true Thornfield. I thought about how disappointed he would be to see his family treating his widow like discarded furniture, and then I thought about the conversation I had had 3 months ago with James Whitmore III, the senior partner at Whitmore, Sterling and Associates. I thought about the documents he had shown me, the will that had been sealed for decades, the truth about Ravenshollow estate that no one in the Thornfield family suspected. I folded the check carefully and slipped it into my apron pocket. "This is very generous," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "Thank you for this token of appreciation." Harrison's smile widened, clearly pleased that his generosity was being properly acknowledged. Diana actually clapped her hands together once, as if applauding a satisfactory conclusion to an unpleasant business matter. "Wonderful," Diana exclaimed. "I'm so glad you understand. Change can be difficult, but it's often for the best." "Yes," I said, still speaking quietly. "Change can definitely be for the best." I looked around the room at the faces of people I had served for decades. Cousin Patricia, who had snapped her fingers at me for wine refills. Uncle David, who had demanded special parking accommodations. Frederick and Jennifer, who had insisted on the chocolate mousse cake that had required 6 additional hours of work. The Ashworth family from Boston, who had brought food allergies and attitude in equal measure. And at the head of the table, Harrison and Diana, the couple who had just sold what they believed to be their family estate and dismissed me with a check that wouldn't cover a month's rent in most cities. None of them had any idea what was coming. "Actually," I said, my voice growing stronger, "since this is my last family gathering, I think I should share something with all of you too." The room stirred with mild interest. A few people reached for their wine glasses, expecting perhaps a sentimental farewell speech from the longtime family servant. "I had an interesting conversation a few months ago with James Whitmore III, I continued. "He's the senior partner at Whitmore Sterling and Associates, the law firm that has handled Thornfield family legal matters for more than 60 years. Harrison's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Diana's smile became more fixed, less natural. "Mr. Whitmore called me because he had discovered some documents that had been sealed since 1962. I said, reaching into my other apron pocket. "Documents that he felt I should see, given that they directly affected my legal status." I pulled out a folded set of papers that I had been carrying with me for months, waiting for the right moment to reveal their contents. "It seems that Thomas's grandmother, Evelyn Thornfield, left a very detailed will when she died," I said, unfolding the papers slowly. "A will that included some very specific provisions about Ravenshollow estate." The room had grown so quiet that I could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantelpiece. Harrison was staring at the papers in my hands as if they might spontaneously combust. "According to Evelyn Thornfield's will," I continued, my voice now carrying clearly to every corner of the room, "Ravenshollow estate was not to be inherited by her son Edmund. Instead, it was to be held in trust until one of her grandsons married a woman who demonstrated unwavering loyalty, selfless devotion, and genuine commitment to family welfare over a period of not less than 25 years. Diana's face had gone pale. Harrison looked like he might be having trouble breathing. The will specified that when such a woman was identified, the estate would be transferred directly to her, bypassing the male lineage entirely. I smiled for the first time since Harrison's announcement. Evelyn apparently had some very strong opinions about how women were treated in the Thornfield family. The papers rustled as I turned to the final page, the one that contained the legal language that had changed everything I thought I knew about my place in this family. 3 months ago, after 40 years of marriage to Thomas and continued service to this family even after his death, I was formally recognized as meeting Evelyn's criteria. I looked directly at Harrison, whose face had turned an alarming shade of red. "Ravenshollow estate was transferred to my name. I own this house, Harrison. I own the land it sits on. I own every brick, every board, every crystal chandelier." The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. "You own," Diana whispered, her voice barely audible. Everything, I confirmed. And Harrison, about that sale to Meridian Development Corporation. You just sold property that doesn't belong to you. I believe that's called fraud. The explosion of voices that erupted after my revelation about owning Ravenshollow Estate was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in 40 years of family gatherings. It was as if I had thrown a grenade into the center of their perfect world and watched the shrapnel tear through their assumptions about power, money, and family hierarchy. Harrison was the first to recover his voice. Though what emerged was more of a strangled shout than coherent speech. That's impossible, he bellowed, his face now a dangerous shade of purple. This estate has been in our family for generations. You can't just claim ownership because of some dusty old papers. But even as he protested, I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Harrison was many things arrogant, entitled, dismissive, but he wasn't stupid. He understood the implications of what I had just revealed, and he understood that if I was telling the truth, he had just committed a federal crime by selling property that didn't belong to him. Diana had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup standing out against her pale skin like war paint on a ghost. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "Eleanor, you're clearly confused. You're 73 years old, and grief can sometimes cause people to misinterpret documents, grief-induced confusion." She was suggesting that I was either senile or delusional, that my claim to the estate was the product of an aging mind unable to process reality. It was a cruel strategy, but not unexpected from someone who had just watched her golden ticket to wealth disappear. "I want to see these supposed documents," Frederick demanded, rising from his chair so quickly that his wine glass toppled over, sending red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "Eleanor, if you're making false claims about property ownership, that's a serious legal matter. You could be charged with fraud yourself." The irony of Frederick accusing me of fraud while his brother had just sold my property to developers was almost too perfect. But I remained calm, reaching into my purse to retrieve the folder I had brought specifically for this moment. "Here are the documents," I said, placing the thick folder on the dining table where everyone could see it. "Copies of Evelyn Thornfield's original will, the sealed trust documentation, the court orders recognizing my legal claim, and the deed transfer that was finalized 3 months ago. Everything properly notarized, filed, and recorded with the county registrar." Vivian had been silent since my revelation, but now she spoke up from her wheelchair, her voice carrying the authority she had wielded for nearly 9 decades. "Eleanor, I was Evelyn's daughter-in-law for 30 years. I knew her better than anyone. She would never have done something so destructive to the family legacy." But as Vivian spoke, I could see uncertainty flickering in her pale blue eyes. She was old enough to remember Evelyn Thornfield personally. Old enough to remember the formidable woman who had helped build the family fortune, and who had very strong opinions about how women should be treated. "Actually, Mrs. Thornfield," I said, using the formal address I had maintained for decades. According to the law firm's records, Evelyn was quite explicit about her reasons for structuring the inheritance this way. She left a sealed letter explaining her decision, which was opened when the trust conditions were met. I reached into the folder and withdrew a photocopy of Evelyn's letter, written in her distinctive handwriting on expensive stationery that bore the Thornfield family crest. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" She had some very interesting things to say about how the Thornfield men treated their wives. The room had grown deadly quiet again, but this silence was different from before. This wasn't the respectful quiet of people listening to announcements about windfall inheritances. This was the tense silence of people realizing that their entire world was shifting beneath their feet. Harrison snatched. "Ravenshollow Estate was transferred to my name. I own this house, Harrison. I own the land it sits on. I own every brick, every board, every crystal chandelier." The silence that followed was so complete it felt like the entire world had stopped breathing. "You own," Diana whispered, her voice barely audible, "everything," I confirmed. "And Harrison, about that sale to Meridian Development Corporation. You just sold property that doesn't belong to you. I believe that's called fraud." The explosion of voices that erupted after my revelation about owning Raven's Hollow estate was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in 40 years of family gatherings. It was as if I had thrown a grenade into the center of their perfect world and watched the shrapnel tear through their assumptions about power, money, and family hierarchy. Harrison was the first to recover his voice. Though what emerged was more of a strangled shout than coherent speech. "That's impossible," he bellowed, his face now a dangerous shade of purple. "This estate has been in our family for generations. You can't just claim ownership because of some dusty old papers." But even as he protested, I could see the fear creeping into his eyes. Harrison was many things: arrogant, entitled, dismissive, but he wasn't stupid. He understood the implications of what I had just revealed, and he understood that if I was telling the truth, he had just committed a federal crime by selling property that didn't belong to him. Diana had gone completely white, her carefully applied makeup standing out against her pale skin like war paint on a ghost. "This is ridiculous," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled panic. "Eleanor, you're clearly confused. You're 73 years old, and grief can sometimes cause people to misinterpret documents, grief-induced confusion." She was suggesting that I was either senile or delusional, that my claim to the estate was the product of an aging mind unable to process reality. It was a cruel strategy, but not unexpected from someone who had just watched her golden ticket to wealth disappear. "I want to see these supposed documents," Frederick demanded, rising from his chair so quickly that his wine glass toppled over, sending red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like blood. "Eleanor, if you're making false claims about property ownership, that's a serious legal matter. You could be charged with fraud yourself." The irony of Frederick accusing me of fraud while his brother had just sold my property to developers was almost too perfect. But I remained calm, reaching into my purse to retrieve the folder I had brought specifically for this moment. "Here are the documents," I said, placing the thick folder on the dining table where everyone could see it. "Copies of Evelyn Thornfield's original will, the sealed trust documentation, the court orders recognizing my legal claim, and the deed transfer that was finalized 3 months ago. Everything properly notarized, filed, and recorded with the county registrar." Vivian had been silent since my revelation, but now she spoke up from her wheelchair, her voice carrying the authority she had wielded for nearly 9 decades. "Eleanor, I was Evelyn's daughter-in-law for 30 years. I knew her better than anyone. She would never have done something so destructive to the family legacy." But as Vivian spoke, I could see uncertainty flickering in her pale blue eyes. She was old enough to remember Evelyn Thornfield personally. Old enough to remember the formidable woman who had helped build the family fortune, and who had very strong opinions about how women should be treated. "Actually, Mrs. Thornfield," I said, using the formal address I had maintained for decades. "According to the law firm's records, Evelyn was quite explicit about her reasons for structuring the inheritance this way. She left a sealed letter explaining her decision, which was opened when the trust conditions were met." I reached into the folder and withdrew a photocopy of Evelyn's letter, written in her distinctive handwriting on expensive stationery that bore the Thornfield family crest. "Would you like me to read it aloud?" She had some very interesting things to say about how the Thornfield men treated their wives. The room had grown deadly quiet again, but this silence was different from before. This wasn't the respectful quiet of people listening to announcements about windfall inheritances. This was the tense silence of people realizing that their entire world was shifting beneath their feet. Harrison snatched the folder from the table and began rifling through the documents, his hands shaking as he scanned legal terminology and official seals. Diana peered over his shoulder, her eyes widening as she read the court orders that confirmed the property transfer. "This can't be legal," Harrison muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "There has to be some kind of statute of limitations, some way to challenge this." The moment I mentioned that Evelyn Thornfield's will had transferred more than just the estate to me, I watched the color drain from every face in the room. But instead of backing down, instead of reconsidering their approach, instead of showing even a shred of humility or respect, the Thornfield family did what they had always done when faced with resistance. they escalated their attacks to a level that crossed every line of human decency. Harrison was the first to completely lose control. He lunged across the dining table, scattering wine glasses and sending the elaborate centerpiece I had spent and arranging crashing to the floor. His face was twisted with rage as he grabbed for the folder in my hands, his expensive shirt catching on the edge of a serving platter and sending roasted vegetables flying across the mahogany surface. "Give me those papers," he roared, his voice echoing off the mansion's high ceilings. "I don't care what lies some senile old woman wrote in her will 60 years ago, this is my family's estate. And I'm not letting some gold-digging housekeeper steal it from us." Gold-digging housekeeper. After 40 years of marriage to his brother, after decades of unpaid service to his family, after countless personal sacrifices made for their benefit, Harrison was reducing me to the level of a fortune-hunting servant who had somehow conned her way into an inheritance. But his physical aggression toward me was just the beginning of what would become the most vicious, degrading assault I had ever experienced in my 73 years of life. Diana grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone who spent most of her time in yoga classes and spa treatments. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin as she tried to wrestle the folder away from me, her composed facade completely shattered. "You pathetic old witch," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Do you think we're going to let you destroy our lives over some stupid piece of paper? You're nothing but a dried-up librarian who got lucky when Thomas was desperate enough to marry beneath his station." Dried-up librarian. Married beneath his station. Diana was attacking not just my claim to this state, but my worth as a human being, my appearance, my profession, and my entire 40-year relationship with Thomas. But the family was just getting started. Frederick abandoned any pretense of civility and joined the physical assault, grabbing my other arm and trying to pin me against the wall while Harrison continued to grab for the papers. "You senile old bat," he shouted, his spittle hitting my face as he pressed closer. "Thomas only married you because he felt sorry for you. Everyone knew you were just—" The moment I mentioned that Evelyn Thornfield's will had transferred more than just the estate to me, I watched the color drain from every face in the room. But instead of backing down, instead of reconsidering their approach, instead of showing even a shred of humility or respect, the Thornfield family did what they had always done when faced with resistance. They escalated their attacks to a level that crossed every line of human decency. Harrison was the first to completely lose control. He lunged across the dining table, scattering wine glasses and sending the elaborate centerpiece I had spent and arranging crashing to the floor. His face was twisted with rage as he grabbed for the folder in my hands, his expensive shirt catching on the edge of a serving platter and sending roasted vegetables flying across the mahogany surface. "Give me those papers," he roared, his voice echoing off the mansion's high ceilings. "I don't care what lies some senile old woman wrote in her will 60 years ago, this is my family's estate. And I'm not letting some gold-digging housekeeper steal it from us." Gold-digging housekeeper. After 40 years of marriage to his brother, after decades of unpaid service to his family, after countless personal sacrifices made for their benefit, Harrison was reducing me to the level of a fortune-hunting servant who had somehow conned her way into an inheritance. But his physical aggression toward me was just the beginning of what would become the most vicious, degrading assault I had ever experienced in my 73 years of life. Diana grabbed my arm with surprising strength for someone who spent most of her time in yoga classes and spa treatments. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into my skin as she tried to wrestle the folder away from me, her composed facade completely shattered. "You pathetic old witch," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "Do you think we're going to let you destroy our lives over some stupid piece of paper? You're nothing but a dried-up librarian who got lucky when Thomas was desperate enough to marry beneath his station." Dried-up librarian. Married beneath his station. Diana was attacking not just my claim to this state, but my worth as a human being, my appearance, my profession, and my entire 40-year relationship with Thomas. But the family was just getting started. Frederick abandoned any pretense of civility and joined the physical assault, grabbing my other arm and trying to pin me against the wall while Harrison continued to grab for the papers. "You senile old bat," he shouted, his spittle hitting my face as he pressed closer. "Thomas only married you because he felt sorry for you. Everyone knew you were just a charity case who wouldn't leave him alone, a charity case who wouldn't leave him alone." Frederick was rewriting the history of my relationship with Thomas, painting my marriage as an act of pity rather than love, suggesting that I had somehow forced or manipulated Thomas into marrying me. But even as the two men physically restrained me, even as Diana clawed at the papers in my hands, the verbal assault from the rest of the family reached levels of cruelty that I couldn't have imagined in my worst nightmares. Vivian, the 89-year-old matriarch who I had nursed through her stroke recovery, who I had fed and bathed and read to during her months of rehabilitation, wheeled her chair closer and delivered the most poisonous words of all. "You disgusting parasite," she hissed, her pale blue eyes filled with venom. "I knew from the moment Thomas brought you home that you were nothing but a leech looking for a wealthy family to attach you yourself to. You spent 40 years pretending to care about us while you plotted to steal everything we built. Disgusting parasite, leech." After 40 years of devoted service, Vivian was suggesting that every act of kindness, every sacrifice, every moment of care I had provided had been calculated manipulation designed to steal their wealth. Cousin Patricia, emboldened by the family's collective attack, added her own vicious commentary. "Look at her," she laughed, pointing at me as if I were an exhibit in a freak show. "A 73-year-old woman thinking she deserves to live in a mansion. You should be grateful we let you eat at the kitchen table all these years instead of making you take your meals in the servants' quarters where you belonged." Where you belonged. Patricia was making it clear that in her mind, I had never been family, never been an equal, never been deserving of basic human respect. But the attack that finally broke through my composure came from Jennifer, Frederick's wife, who had always been the most soft-spoken member of the family. Her transformation from quiet politeness to savage cruelty was perhaps the most shocking of all. "You know what I think?" Jennifer said, her voice carrying clearly across the room despite the chaos of the physical struggle. "I think Eleanor has been planning this for years. I think she's been poisoning Thomas against his family, manipulating him during his illness, maybe even contributing to his death so she could claim some imaginary inheritance." Contributing to his death. Jennifer was suggesting that I had somehow hastened my beloved husband's death from cancer, that I had murdered the man I loved in order to steal money from his family. The room erupted in agreement, voices piling on top of each other in a crescendo of accusations and threats. She probably forged those documents. No legitimate lawyer would have kept something like this secret for so long. She's obviously having some kind of mental breakdown. Someone should call the police and have her committed. This is elder abuse in reverse. She's trying to abuse us. But it was Uncle David from California who delivered the final, unforgivable blow that crossed every line of human decency. "You want to know what I really think," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. "I think this pathetic old woman has been living in a fantasy world for so long that she actually believes her own lies. Look at her, 73 years old, no children, no real friends, no life outside of serving this family. She's so desperate for relevance that she's invented this whole elaborate delusion about inheriting this state." He paused, letting his words sink in before delivering the final insult. "Thomas probably only stayed married to you out of pity," David continued, his voice dripping with contempt. "Everyone could see how desperate and clingy you were. A real man would have divorced years ago, but Thomas was too kind to abandon such a pathetic creature. And now that he's dead, you're so—" But there were no excuses for what I was witnessing now. There was no explaining away physical violence, public humiliation, and accusations of murder. There was no rationalizing the level of cruelty they were displaying toward a woman who had spent for decades serving their needs. They had shown me their true faces, and those faces were uglier than I had ever imagined possible. I reached up slowly and wiped Diana's spit from my forehead with the back of my hand. The dining room was still partially chaotic, with overturned chairs and scattered food from Harrison's assault on the table, but the family had fallen quiet again, watching to see how their victim would respond to being physically attacked and publicly humiliated. I looked around the room at faces I had seen at hundreds of family gatherings over for decades. Faces I had smiled at while serving their meals. Faces I had worried about during family crises. Faces I had celebrated with during happy occasions. Now those same faces were looking at me with contempt, but there were no excuses for what I was witnessing now. There was no explaining away physical violence, public humiliation, and accusations of murder. There was no rationalizing the level of cruelty they were displaying toward a woman who had spent for decades serving their needs. They had shown me their true faces, and those faces were uglier than I had ever imagined possible. I reached up slowly and wiped Diana's spit from my forehead with the back of my hand. The dining room was still partially chaotic, with overturned chairs and scattered food from Harrison's assault on the table, but the family had fallen quiet again, watching to see how their victim would respond to being physically attacked and publicly humiliated. I looked around the room at faces I had seen at hundreds of family gatherings over for decades. Faces I had smiled at while serving their meals. Faces I had worried about during family crises. Faces I had celebrated with during happy occasions. Now those same faces were looking at me with contempt, satisfaction, and anticipation. They were waiting to see if their assault had broken my spirit, if their cruelty had convinced me to surrender my legal rights and accept whatever scraps they were willing to offer. They were about to be very disappointed. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. The question seemed to catch them off guard. Harrison was still breathing heavily from his physical exertion. Diana was examining her broken nails from our struggle, and the rest of the family was watching with the eager attention of spectators at a gladiator match. "Because if you are," I continued, my voice growing stronger, "I have something to tell you about that second folder, and about what else Evelyn Thornfield left to me in her will." I straightened my shoulders and smoothed down my hair, refusing to let their assault diminish my dignity. The papers they had tried so desperately to take from me were still in my possession, slightly crumpled from the struggle but completely intact. "You see," I said, opening the second folder with hands that were perfectly steady despite everything they had just put me through. "When Evelyn Thornfield decided to leave Ravenshollow Estate to whoever proved themselves worthy, through 25 years of devoted service, she also included something else in that inheritance." I pulled out a thick document and held it up for everyone to see. "She left me controlling interest in Thornfield Holdings, the investment company that manages all of the family's business assets." The silence that followed was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat. "That means I now own 51% of the company that controls your trust funds, your investment portfolios, your real estate holdings, and your business ventures," I continued, my voice calm and clear, "including Harrison's real estate development company, Frederick's consulting firm, and the various business interests that provide income to every person in this room." I let that information settle in for a moment before delivering the final blow. "And as the majority shareholder of Thornfield Holdings, I have the legal authority to dissolve the company, liquidate its assets, and terminate all financial support to family members." The folder rustled as I turned to the next page, where Evelyn's handwritten letter explained her reasoning for this unusual inheritance structure. According to Evelyn's letter, I said, she wanted to make sure that the woman who inherited her estate would also have the financial power to protect herself from exactly the kind of behavior you've all demonstrated here today. I looked directly at Harrison, whose face had gone from purple with rage to ash gray with terror. She wrote, and I quote, "If the Thornfield men prove themselves to be as cruel and greedy as I suspect they will be, the woman who inherits this estate should have the means to defend herself against their inevitable attacks." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the folder. "So let me make this very clear," I said, my voice carrying the authority of someone who had just discovered she controlled the financial fate of everyone in the room. You have just physically assaulted, publicly humiliated, and viciously degraded the woman who now controls your entire financial future." The silence stretched on as the implications began to dawn on them. Every trust fund payment, every business loan, every investment return, every source of unearned income that had supported their comfortable lifestyles, all of it was now under my control. You spat on me, I said. Looking directly at Diana. You struck me, I said, turning to Harrison. You accused me of murder, I said, focusing on Jennifer. You called me a parasite and a leech, I said, addressing Vivian. I paused, letting each accusation hang in the air like a sword waiting to fall. And now, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, you're going to learn exactly what happens when you cross the woman who holds your financial lives in her hands. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as the full scope of their situation became clear. They had just committed the most brutal assault imaginable against the one person who could destroy them financially with a single phone call. But I wasn't finished yet, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that Evelyn Thornfield's inheritance included one more surprise that would turn their world completely upside down. And after what they had just put me through, I was going to enjoy every moment of revealing it to them, as I stood in the wreckage of what had once been an elegant family dining room. My cheeks still stinging from Harrison's slap and Diana's spit, having just dried on my forehead. I realized that this moment, this precise moment of having been physically assaulted and publicly humiliated by people I had served for 40 years was exactly what I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire adult life, not because I had anticipated their cruelty, but because every slight, every dismissal, every moment of being treated as less than human had been teaching me to document everything, to save everything, to remember everything, and most importantly, to trust my instincts about the kind of people I was dealing with. The room remained frozen in the aftermath of my revelation about controlling Thornfield Holdings. 48 faces stared at me with expressions ranging from terror to disbelief to barely controlled panic. They were beginning to understand that the elderly woman they had just brutalized was not the powerless victim they had assumed her to be. But what they didn't understand yet was just how thoroughly I had been preparing for this moment, or how completely I had anticipated their behavior. You're all wondering how this is possible, I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. You're wondering how a simple librarian from Millbrook could have ended up controlling a multi-million-dollar investment company and owning this state you've considered your birthright for generations. I opened my purse and withdrew a third folder, this one even thicker than the first two. The answer is quite simple, really. For the past 3 years, ever since Thomas died, I've been working very closely with James Whitmore III to understand exactly what Evelyn Thornfield intended when she structured her will the way she did. I set the folder on the dining table, right in the middle of the chaos Harrison had created during his assault on me. Wine stains and scattered food surrounded the pristine legal documents like a border of evidence, showing exactly who the real barbarians were in this room. You see, Evelyn Thornfield was far more intelligent than any of you ever realized, I continued, opening the folder to reveal page after page of financial documents, investment records, and legal analyses. She didn't just want to reward a loyal woman with property. She wanted to create a system that would expose the true character of her male descendants. Harrison made a strangled sound that might have been an attempt at words, but I continued. Before he could form coherent speech, Evelyn suspected that the Thornfield men would react to losing their inheritance exactly the way you've reacted today, I said, looking around the room at the evidence of their assault. Frederick's face went white as I continued reading. She also wrote about Harrison. My eldest grandson has the business instincts of his great-grandfather but none of his integrity. He will likely succeed financially. Frederick's face went white as I continued reading. She also wrote about Harrison. My eldest grandson has the business instincts of his great-grandfather but none of his integrity. He will likely succeed financially but at the cost of treating everyone around him as disposable resources rather than human beings deserving of respect. I turned to another page, and about Thomas. Thomas has the kindest heart of all my grandsons. But he is weak when it comes to standing up to his family. He will likely marry a good woman who will be mistreated by the rest of the family, and he will fail to protect her adequately from their cruelty. The accuracy of Evelyn's predictions was stunning. She had written these observations 60 years ago, but they perfectly described the dynamics that had played out during my 40 years in the family. Evelyn's will wasn't just about rewarding loyalty, I explained, my voice growing stronger as I revealed the true scope of what she had planned. It was about creating a test. She wanted to see if her descendants would prove her wrong about their character, or if they would behave exactly as she expected them to. I gestured around the destroyed dining room, at the overturned chairs and scattered food and wine stains that marked the aftermath of their assault on me. I think we can safely say that you've all passed her test with flying colors, I said. You've proven yourselves to be exactly as cruel, entitled, and morally bankrupt as she predicted you would be. But revealing Evelyn's psychological insights was just the beginning of what I had prepared for this moment. The real shock was what I had been doing for the past 3 years while they assumed I was grieving quietly in my little house in Millbrook. What you don't know, I continued, is that James Whitmore III and I have been conducting a comprehensive audit of Thornfield Holdings and all its subsidiary companies for the past 36 months. I pulled out a bound report that was easily 3 inches thick. We've discovered some very interesting patterns in how the family's money has been managed over the years. The color drained from Harrison's face so quickly that I thought he might faint. Diana grabbed the back of a chair for support, her knuckles white with tension. For example, I said, opening the report to a section marked with yellow tabs. We found evidence that Harrison has been systematically overcharging Thornfield Holdings for his real estate services, inflating commission rates, and billing the family investment company for personal expenses disguised as business costs. Harrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound emerged. The total amount of fraudulent billing over the past 10 years comes to approximately $1.2 million, I continued, reading directly from the audit report, which, under federal law, constitutes felony embezzlement from a family trust. I turned to another tabbed section. Frederick's consulting company has similar issues. Billing for services never rendered, charging premium rates for work performed by junior staff, and claiming business expenses for family vacations and personal entertainment. Frederick tried to speak, but his voice came out as a whisper. Those are legitimate business practices. According to the IRS regulations we researched, no, they're not, I replied calmly. They constitute tax fraud and fiduciary breach, both of which carry significant criminal penalties. But the financial fraud was just the tip of the iceberg. Compared to what else I had discovered, the most interesting finding, though, came when we investigated the various business deals that Thornfield Holdings has invested in over the years, I said, turning to a section of the report that was marked with red tabs instead of yellow. It turns out that Harrison's real estate development company has been consistently steering family investment money toward projects that benefit his personal business interests, often in direct conflict with the family trust's financial well-being. I looked directly at Harrison, whose face had gone from white to gray. The Riverside Commons project, for instance. Thornfield Holdings invested $2.3 million in a shopping center development that was guaranteed to fail because you had already signed lease agreements that made profitability impossible. Diana made a sound that might have been a sob or a gasp, but Harrison's personal construction company received over $800,000 in guaranteed payments for that project, regardless of whether it succeeded or failed, I continued. Which means you used family money to guarantee your own profits while knowingly creating losses for the trust. I turned another page. The Portland office complex, the Ashford Heights residential development, the failed casino project in Nevada. The same pattern repeats over and over again. Family money invested in projects designed to benefit Harrison personally, regardless of their impact on other family members' financial security. The room was so quiet that I could hear the antique clock ticking on the mantelpiece, marking the seconds until their world collapsed completely. The total amount of family money that Harrison has diverted to his personal benefit over the past 15 years is approximately $8.7 million, I said, reading the final calculation from the audit report. All of it documented, all of It traceable, and all of it constituting felony breach of fiduciary duty, but I still wasn't finished revealing the extent of my preparation. Of course, financial fraud wasn't the only thing we investigated, I said, setting the audit report aside and reaching for yet another folder. We also looked into the personal conduct of family members, particularly as it related to their fitness to continue receiving trust fund benefits. This folder contained private investigation reports, background checks, and documentation that I had been gathering for 3 years while everyone assumed I was too grief-stricken to pay attention to family business. Diana, for instance, I said, opening to a section filled with photographs and legal documents. Your first marriage didn't end because of irreconcilable differences as you've always claimed. It ended because you were caught embezzling $300,000 from your ex-husband's medical practice to fund your gambling addiction. Diana's legs gave out and she collapsed into the nearest chair, her face a mask of pure terror. The charges were dropped because your ex-husband didn't want the publicity, but the evidence of the embezzlement is quite clear, I continued, showing photographs of bank records and canceled checks, which raises interesting questions about your fitness to have access to family trust funds, doesn't it? I turned to another section of the private investigation report. Frederick, your consulting business is largely fictional, I said, reading from a detailed analysis of his company's operations. Most of your supposed clients are either family friends who pay you for services never rendered, or shell companies that exist only to create the appearance of legitimate business activity. Frederick was gripping the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. Your actual income for the past 5 years has been almost entirely dependent on trust fund distributions and payments from family-controlled companies, I continued, which means you've been essentially unemployed while pretending to run a successful consulting firm. But the most devastating revelations were still to come. Vivian, I said, turning my attention to the family matriarch who had called me a disgusting parasite just minutes earlier. Your management of family finances during your years as trust administrator was problematic. I pulled out bank records and investment statements that went back decades. Between 1985 and 2010, while you controlled family trust distributions, you consistently favored your biological descendants while minimizing payments to family members you considered less worthy, I said, reading from a detailed analysis of payment patterns. Thomas, for instance, received significantly smaller trust distributions than Harrison or Frederick, despite being entitled to equal treatment under the trust documents. Vivian's pale blue eyes filled with something that might have been fear or rage or both. The total amount of money that should have been distributed to Thomas over those 25 years, but which was instead diverted to your other sons, comes to approximately $1.8 million, I continued. Money that would have made our marriage more comfortable, that would have reduced the financial stress that contributed to his health problems, and that would have allowed us to take vacations and enjoy experiences we never had because of artificial financial constraints you imposed. I closed the investigation report and set it on top of the audit documents. So let me summarize what we've discovered, I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. Harrison has embezzled over $1 million from family accounts and diverted nearly $9 million in family investments to benefit his personal business interests. Diana is a convicted embezzler with an active gambling problem. Frederick has been essentially unemployed for years while all of this information has been compiled into detailed reports and submitted to the appropriate federal authorities, I continued, enjoying the looks of absolute terror that were spreading across their faces. The IRS has opened investigations into the tax fraud, the FBI is reviewing the embezzlement evidence, and the state attorney general's office is examining the breach of fiduciary duty charges. I paused, letting the full implications of what I had just revealed sink in. But here's the most important part, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. For the past 3 years, while you all assumed I was too stupid and too grief-stricken to understand family business, I've been working with federal authorities to build criminal cases against every single person in this room who has been stealing From the family trust. I gestured around the dining room at the faces of people who had just learned that their lives were about to be destroyed by the woman they had been treating as a harmless old F. The sweet little librarian you just assaulted has been working as an undercover informant for federal investigators, I said, allowing myself to smile for the first time since Harrison had announced the estate sale. Every conversation, every family gathering, every business meeting I've attended for the past 3 years has been documented and reported to law enforcement. The folder I was holding contained copies of dozens of reports I had filed with various federal agencies, each one detailing specific instances of fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy that I had witnessed during family gatherings. So, when you spat in my face, I said, looking directly at Diana, you were spitting on a federal informant. When you struck me, I said, turning to Harrison, you were assaulting someone who has been working with the FBI to document your crimes. And when you called me a parasite and a leech, I said, addressing Vivian, you were insulting the woman who has been providing evidence that will likely send you to federal prison. The room remained frozen in stunned silence as the full scope of their situation became clear. Not only had they just brutally attacked the woman who controlled their financial future, they had attacked someone who had been working with federal law enforcement to document their criminal activity. But I still had one more revelation that would complete their understanding of just how thoroughly they had underestimated the quiet librarian they had been dismissing for 40 years. There's just one more thing you should know, I said, reaching into my purse for the final folder I had brought to this reunion. About what else I've been doing while you thought I was too simple to understand the complexities of family business. I opened the folder to reveal a collection of photographs, audio transcripts, and surveillance reports that represented 3 years of the most thorough documentation project of my entire life. You see, when someone has been invisible in a family for 40 years, when someone has been treated as hired help rather than a family member, when someone has been dismissed as too stupid and too unimportant to pay attention to, that person sees and hears everything. I smiled as I looked around the room at the people who were about to learn exactly how much the invisible woman had been observing during all those years of being ignored. And everything I've seen and heard over the past for decades is about to become evidence in the most comprehensive criminal investigation this family has ever faced. The final folder I opened contained something that no one in that room could have anticipated. Something that would not only complete their understanding of how thoroughly they had underestimated me, but would also reveal the deepest truth about our family dynamics that would destroy their sense of reality forever. This folder, I said, setting it carefully on the table among the wreckage of their assault, contains documentation of every significant conversation, every family meeting, every private discussion, and every cruel comment that has taken place in my presence over the past 40 years. I opened it to reveal hundreds of pages of handwritten notes, typed transcripts, and even audio recordings that I had been making since the early days of my marriage to Thomas. You see, when someone is treated as invisible as I have been, when someone is consistently dismissed as unimportant and unintelligent, that person develops certain survival skills. One of those skills is learning to document everything, because you know that someday someone will try to gaslight you into believing that your experiences weren't real. Harrison was staring at the folder as if it contained a nuclear weapon. You've been recording us for 40 years, I confirmed. Every Christmas dinner where you made jokes about my background. Every Easter gathering where Vivian made snide comments about my inability to have children. Every summer reunion where you discussed family business as if I wasn't in the room, revealing information you never intended for me to hear. I pulled out a transcript dated 15 years earlier. For instance, this conversation from Christmas 2009, when you all thought I was in the kitchen doing dishes. Harrison, you told Frederick that you were deliberately steering family investments toward projects that would fail so you could buy the properties at reduced prices through shell companies you control. Harrison's face went gray. That conversation never happened. I have the audio recording, I said simply, pulling out a small digital device. Would you like me to play it for everyone? Your exact words were, "The old bat is too stupid to understand finance anyway. As long as we keep her busy in the kitchen, we can structure these deals however we want." Diana made a choking sound. Frederick was gripping the edge of the table so hard I thought he might break it. "Or this conversation from Easter 2012, I continued, selecting another transcript. "Vivienne, you told Cousin Patricia that you had been reducing Thomas's trust fund distributions for years because you wanted to teach that gold-digging librarian that she married into the wrong family if she expected an easy life." Vivian's pale blue eyes filled with something that might have been panic. "Eleanor, you're clearly confused about what you heard." "I have 37 separate recordings of you making similar statements," I said, gesturing to a thick stack of transcripts, all of them clearly documenting your deliberate financial abuse of your own son and his wife. But the recordings and transcripts were just the beginning of what I had been documenting all these years. The really interesting discoveries came when I started researching the family history that none of you ever bothered to share with me. I continued, reaching for a section of the folder marked with blue tabs. Because it turns out that the Thornfield family legacy is built on some very interesting foundations. I pulled out genealogical records, historical documents, and legal papers that told a story none of them knew I had uncovered. For instance, did you know that the original Thornfield fortune was built entirely by women? I asked, looking around at faces that had gone from panic to confusion. Edmund's great-grandmother, Constance Thornfield, was the one who actually built the railroad empire that established the family wealth. But the business was put in her husband's name because women couldn't legally own property at that time. I turned to another page of historical records. And Evelyn Thornfield didn't just marry into wealth, she was the one who managed the family investments and expanded the business empire during the Great Depression. Every major financial decision that saved the family fortune was made by her, not by her husband. Frederick was staring at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. That's not what we were told about family history. Because the men in this family have been taking credit for women's achievements for over a century, I said, my voice growing stronger as I revealed the truth they had never wanted to acknowledge. And Evelyn knew it. That's why she structured her will the way she did. She wanted to make sure that at least one woman in the Thornfield family would finally receive credit for her contributions. But even this revelation paled in comparison to what I was about to share next. However, the most important discovery I made wasn't about the past, I said, reaching for the final section of my documentation. It was about the present. About what has really been happening in this family for the past 40 years. I pulled out a thick folder that contained medical records, financial documents, and investigative reports that represented years of careful research and documentation. Thomas didn't die from pancreatic cancer, I said quietly, my words falling into the silent room like stones into a deep well. The statement was so unexpected, so shocking, that for a moment no one seemed to understand what I had said. "What?" Harrison whispered. "Thomas died from chronic arsenic poisoning," I continued, my voice steady despite the magnitude of what I was revealing. "Slow-acting, carefully administered doses over a period of approximately 2 years, just enough to cause the symptoms that were initially misdiagnosed as cancer, but not enough to be immediately detected by standard medical tests." Diana's wine glass slipped from her nerveless fingers and crashed to the floor, sending crystal shards scattering across the Persian rug. The private autopsy the first commissioned after his death revealed elevated levels of arsenic in his hair and nail samples, I continued, pulling out medical reports that I had been keeping secret for 3 years. The poisoning was sophisticated, deliberate, and designed to look like natural illness. Vivian's voice came out as barely a whisper. "That's impossible. Thomas had cancer. The doctors confirmed it. The doctors confirmed symptoms that are consistent with cancer," I corrected. "But arsenic poisoning can mimic cancer symptoms almost perfectly, especially when administered by someone with knowledge of how to mask the effects." I looked around the room at faces that had gone from panic to absolute terror. The question, of course, was who had been systematically poisoning my husband for 2 years, I continued, who had access to his food and medication. who had the medical knowledge to administer arsenic in doses that would cause maximum suffering while avoiding immediate detection, who had the strongest financial motive for wanting Thomas dead. The room was so quiet that I could hear my own breathing. The answer became clear when I reviewed the security footage from the assisted living facility where Vivian was recovering from her stroke, I said, pulling out photographs and video stills that showed exactly what I had discovered. The same facility where Thomas visited his mother every single day for 6 months. The same facility where certain medications were being administered to residents by family members rather than medical staff. I set the photographs on the table where everyone could see them. They showed Vivian in her wheelchair, preparing pills for Thomas from a private supply she kept in her room. Vivian had been giving Thomas what she claimed were herbal supplements to help with his energy and appetite, I continued. Natural remedies that she said would help him stay strong. During her recovery period, Thomas trusted his mother completely and took everything she gave him without question. Vivian was shaking her head frantically. No, that's not. I would never. The supplements contain carefully measured doses of arsenic trioxide, I said. Reading from the toxicology report, enough to gradually destroy his digestive system and immune function, but administered slowly enough that the symptoms appeared to be cancer-related rather than poisoning. I pulled out bank records that showed the purchase history I had uncovered. You bought the arsenic compounds through an online chemical supply company, using a credit card registered to one of your charity organizations. The purchases are all documented, along with internet searches on your personal computer for information about arsenic dosing and symptom progression. Frederick was making strange gasping sounds. As if he couldn't get enough air, Harrison was staring at his mother with an expression of absolute horror. But why? Diana whispered. Because Vivian discovered that Thomas was planning to leave his entire inheritance to me, I said, pulling out copies of legal documents that Thomas had prepared shortly before he became ill. He had met with lawyers about restructuring his will to ensure that I would be financially secure after his death, regardless of how the family treated me. I showed them the draft will that Thomas had been preparing. He was going to leave me not just his personal assets, but also his shares in Thornfield Holdings and his portion of any future family estate distributions. Vivian couldn't allow that to happen. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Purchase records for the poison, video footage of Vivian administering the supplements, medical records showing the progression of arsenic poisoning, computer searches documenting her research into how to commit the perfect murder. So she killed him, I said simply. She murdered her own son to prevent his wife from inheriting family money. The revelation hung in the air like a physical presence, transforming everything they thought they knew about their family, their mother, and the past 3 years of my grief. But I still wasn't finished. Of course, once I realized that Vivian had murdered Thomas, I had to consider the possibility that she had done this before. I continued, reaching for yet another section of my documentation. So I researched the deaths of other family members over the past 30 years. I pulled out medical records and death certificates that told a pattern of suspicious deaths. Edmund Thornfield, Vivian's husband, died of what was diagnosed as kidney failure in 2018. But kidney failure can also be caused by chronic arsenic poisoning. Thomas's uncle Benjamin, who died in 2015 from supposed heart disease, another condition that can be triggered by arsenic exposure. Frederick was now openly weeping, tears streaming down his face as he realized the implications of what I was revealing. The pattern becomes even clearer when you look at who benefited financially from each death, I continued, showing insurance payouts and inheritance distributions. Every time someone died, Vivian gained greater control over family finances. Every death consolidated more power in her hands. I looked directly at the 89-year-old woman who had called me a disgusting parasite, who had spat in my face, who had murdered my husband, and probably several other family members over the decades. Vivian Thornfield is a serial killer, I said, my voice carrying clearly to every corner of the silent room. She has been systematically murdering family members for 30 years to maintain control over the family fortune. The silence that followed was the silence of people whose entire reality had just been shattered into pieces. All of this evidence has been compiled and submitted to federal authorities. I continued, murder charges are being filed this week. The FBI has been building this case for the past 2 years based on evidence I've provided. I closed the final folder and looked around the room at the faces of people who had spent the afternoon assaulting and humiliating me, not knowing that I held evidence of crimes that would destroy them all. So let me now respond to the demands you made earlier, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. Harrison, you demanded that I transfer ownership of Ravenshollow estate back to the family. That will not be happening. This estate is mine legally, and I will be keeping it. Harrison's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. Diana, you offered to let me work as a caretaker in my own house. I decline. Instead, I'll be having you arrested for assault. And I'll be filing civil lawsuits for the emotional distress you've caused me today. Diana collapsed back into her chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Frederick, you accused me of being mentally incompetent. I think we can all see who the incompetent one is in this family. Your trust fund has been permanently suspended, and your fake consulting business is being investigated by the IRS. Frederick continued weeping, apparently unable to process the magnitude of what was happening. Vivian, you called me a parasite and a leech. You also murdered my husband. You'll be spending the rest of your life in federal prison, where I hope you have time to reflect on what happens when you underestimate the quiet woman you've been dismissing for 40 years. I walked over to where Vivian sat in her wheelchair, looking down at the woman who had controlled this family through fear and manipulation for decades, and to all of you who participated in the assault on me today. Who spat on me and struck me and called me names, who demanded that I surrender my legal rights to solve problems you created. I want you to understand something very clearly. I paused, making sure I had everyone's attention. You have just learned what happens when you cross someone who has been documenting your crimes for 40 years. Someone who has been working with federal authorities to build cases against you. Someone who controls your financial future and holds evidence that will destroy your lives. I picked up my purse and walked toward the dining room exit, stepping carefully around the broken glass and scattered food that marked the aftermath of their assault on me. The property sale to Meridian Development is void since Harrison sold property that belonged to me. Harrison will be facing federal charges for fraud and embezzlement. Diana will be prosecuted for assault and investigated for her previous embezzlement convictions. Frederick will lose his trust fund and face tax evasion charges, and Vivian will be charged with multiple counts of murder. I paused at the doorway and turned back to look at them one final time. As for me, I'll be living very comfortably in my beautiful estate, enjoying the financial security provided by controlling Thornfield Holdings, and taking great satisfaction in knowing that justice has finally been served. I smiled as I looked around the destroyed dining room at the people who had made the mistake of believing that cruelty and entitlement would always triumph over intelligence and preparation. Oh, and one more thing, I said, reaching into my purse for my phone. The entire conversation we've had today has been broadcast live to the FBI surveillance team that's been monitoring this gathering. Gee, they've heard every threat, every assault, every admission of guilt that you've made. I held up my phone, showing the active recording app that had been running since Harrison's first announcement about selling the estate. They'll be arresting everyone shortly. I'd suggest you use the next few minutes to call your lawyers, though I should mention that most of your assets will be frozen pending the criminal investigations. As I walked out of Ravenshollow Estate for the last time as their victim, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. Voices raised in panic, people shouting accusations at each other, the sounds of a family tearing itself apart as they realized the full scope of their situation. But I didn't look back. I had spent 40 years looking back, making excuses for their behavior, hoping they would change, believing they might someday treat me with basic human decency. Now I looked forward, toward a future where I would never again serve anyone who didn't deserve my devotion, never again sacrifice my own well-being for people who saw me as disposable. Never again allow anyone to treat me as less than the intelligent, capable, valuable person I had always been. 6 months later, I was sitting in the solarium of Ravenshollow Estate, my estate, reading the newspaper coverage of the trials that had captivated the state for weeks. Vivian had been sentenced to life in prison without parole for multiple counts of murder. Harrison received 25 years for embezzlement and fraud. Diana got 10 years for assault and her previous embezzlement conviction. Frederick received 15 years for tax evasion and conspiracy. The Thornfield family fortune, what remained of it after legal fees and restitution payments, was under my complete control. I had used much of it to establish a foundation providing financial assistance to women leaving abusive families, ensuring that other women would have resources I had never had during my decades of mistreatment. As I sat in the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows of my beautiful home, I reflected on the lesson I had learned about the true nature of power. For 40 years, I had believed that I was powerless because I was financially dependent, socially isolated, and consistently dismissed by people who saw themselves as my superiors. But real power had never been about money or social status or family connections. Real power was knowledge, preparation, intelligence, and most importantly, the courage to use those advantages when the moment was right. I had spent for decades gathering that power while they assumed I was too simple to understand what was happening around me, and when they finally revealed their true characters completely. When they crossed every line of human decency, I had been ready. They had spat on me at the family reunion, believing they could humiliate and dismiss the quiet librarian who had served them for 40 years. Instead, they learned that I was the one who really owned the house, and everything else. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.